In this lesson, we're talking about the blood system. This is topic 6.2. This is only some of the dot points from 6.2. We'll cover the rest in part 2. This is mainly about normal anatomy and physiology of the circulatory system. Right, the circulatory system talks about heart, all the blood vessels, so the veins, arteries, and capillaries, and sometimes even the lungs are included. Now, lots of different theories went around many years ago about what was the deal with blood, okay? And Galen was the kind of number one authority on this, and that was sort of the 2nd century. And he accepted that we had this blood. It was a dark venous blood, but he thought it formed in the liver and it travelled around the body to deliver nutrients. So they had that bit kind of right. They thought that some blood came in contact with the lungs, makes sense, and then it went to the heart and got pumped around to the brain. They also thought that blood was consumed by the tissues. So once it went out, that was it. It kind of got sucked in by the tissues and then that was it. It needed to be constantly replenished. Now, this was all what was thought until William Harvey came along. In 1628, he was the royal physician in England and he found a lot of scientific evidence that disproved all of the Galen stuff. And he came up with the idea that blood flowed around the vessels in one direction only. It didn't return. It had valves there to prevent the backflow, and that the rate of blood flow was so high that it just wasn't possible that the tissues could actually consume it. So he had to come to the reasoning that really blood was being recycled around the body. His work was based on repeated experimental evidence, so his ideas weren't well received to start with, but they were accepted by the time that he died. Harvey's model was one of double circulation, right? We're talking one-way flow of the blood here, but the blood flows to the lungs. It is picking up oxygen and oxygenated. It then flows to the heart and is pumped around to the rest of the body before it returns to the heart to go through that same thing again. Oxygenated and non or deoxygenated blood doesn't ever mix, and at some points it's very low pressure, so when it's picking up oxygen it's being pumped out at a very low pressure rate, but when it gets back to the heart to pump to the body, it's being pumped, quite a long way, so it's being pumped at a very high pressure. The heart is a double pump. It pumps to the lungs and it pumps to the brain and the body at the same time at different pressures. It's quite complex. Now, the heart, this is a very simplified model. It doesn't look like the pretty love heart that we know of, but it is a simplified model that we will see, and then we will dissect a more complex, realistic one, obviously. The heart has 4 chambers. It's a left and a right side, and it has atria at the top and ventricles at the bottom. See these 4 chambers here, 1, 2, 3, 4. You will see that this is the left side and this is the right side, which is not you or me making an error. That is about looking at it from someone standing in front of you. Their left is on your right, and so on. So the atria are at the top and the ventricles are at the bottom, and that is on both sides. Okay, the valves are in between, and these are the valves here, and they actually stop the blood from backflowing. There's 2 different types of valves here. These are atrioventricular valves between the atrium and the ventricles, right, between that. And there's also valves like this between the ventricles before it is pumped out of the arteries. You often see these in red and blue. Now, blue doesn't mean that our blood is blue. Blue just represents when the blood is deoxygenated, okay? All right, so once again, we're going to see that red and blue over and over. The flow of blood through the heart is such that what it does, if we start up here, it enters through the right atrium, right, down through here. It comes into this section and it's been to the body. It's delivered all of its oxygen, and then it's going to travel down here into the left ventricle before it is pushed out through the pulmonary artery. The artery is delivering blood away from the heart. You can see this artery actually goes in 2 different directions, and what it's doing is taking it to the 2 separate lungs. Once the blood has gone to the lungs, visited the lungs, picked up the oxygen, deposited off the CO2, it comes back into the left atrium at the top there, and then is pushed into the left ventricle. This left ventricle is really meaty and muscly, and the reason it's like that is because it is then pushing all the blood to the body and the heart, and it pushes it out through this aorta. This is a very large artery, and you can see it's got branches that go up to your brain, and it's got a branch that goes down to the rest of your body. There are valves in here. We can see the mitral valve here, the tricuspid valve there, and that stops that backflow. Okay, sometimes there can be broken parts of that valve, or even the septum wall here down the middle can might have a hole in it, and that can lead to mixing of the deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, and that leads to some other outcomes down the track. All right, blood vessels. Again, you're going to see these in red and blue, but I want you to understand they're not actually these colors. Veins only appear blue in our body because the skin absorbs red light and reflects that blue light, and that's what our eyes actually register. The arteries, right, they're carrying blood away from the heart, and veins are carrying it to the heart. But really, it's all about oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And this is what they look like. Look at that. They're both red, okay? But the oxygenated blood with the O2 in it is just that little bit brighter. Okay. Arteries transport blood away from the heart, and most of the time the blood is oxygenated in an artery. The only exception to that is when the blood is leaving the heart to visit the lungs because it hasn't picked up the oxygen yet. Okay, every organ and tissue in the body is serviced by more than one artery, including the heart itself, in case anything goes wrong. So the heart itself is a muscle and does have arteries that deliver blood to it, so therefore oxygen and nutrients. Now the blood is moving at really high pressure, so the walls of an artery must be able to withstand that. Really big change in blood pressure without bulging or bursting. So they're really, really tough, strong, and elastic. The blood pumps through arteries in a pulsatile way. It's through. It's not just streaming continuously like a river. And that's why we can feel a pulse in different parts of our body. Now this here is an artery. You can see it's got that really thick wall. This stuff in here would probably be the red blood cells, but it's got quite a big thick layer here. Okay. Arteries are the main three layers we have are the tunica externa on the outside, and that is a tough outer layer of connective tissue. The tunica media here is the middle layer, and it has smooth muscle fibers and elastin to make it a bit elastic. The tunica intima in the middle here is just a single layer of smooth inside of the tube part and its epithelial cell lining. Now the smooth muscle fibers in this tunica media part here, they're circular fibers, so they control the constriction or how much it's actually squeezing through that blood. If it squeezes in, it's constricting, and it's not allowing much blood to go through, but it is going through at a very high pressure. Now the elastin in there allows it to actually spread out when it's moving, and then it bounces back to constrict again, propelling the blood through the blood vessel. Now, blood is moving into the arteries at a really high pressure. Those circular muscles and the elastin play a really big role in that. And we often talk about blood pressure in systolic and diastolic, and they're pressures that are extolled by the actual heart itself. Now, in the systolic part, the ventricles, so these bottom sections down here, are pushing blood to the lungs or the body, and it's increasing that pressure. The walls of the arteries are being pushed outwards. It's widening that space that the blood can go through, and it stretches those elastic fibers. In the second part, though, the ventricles actually relax. So this bit stops and the pressure lowers, and the elastic fibers can kind of spring back in, and it squeezes the blood through the lumen or the space in the artery there. It's those circular muscles that let that do that. And when they're sprung in, they're constricting, and when they're outwards, they're dilating. So it changes the different pressure based on how big those arteries are constricting or dilating. Now, muscles respond to hormones and neurons, and they can do that. But our normal blood pressures sit around the range of 120 over 80. You might hear a doctor talk about that if they're checking your blood pressure. This is a BioNinja one, and it's about the pressure changes in just the left side of the heart. All right, veins return blood to the heart and are usually filled with deoxygenated blood. The only exception is being when they're returned from the lungs, ready to be pumped to the tissues. The blood is being pumped at a much lower pressure once it's delivered the oxygen and nutrients, so the walls of these don't need to be as thick. They have fewer muscle fibers and fewer elastin fibers. These guys dilate way wider than arteries, and they can hold up to 80% of your total blood volume, unless you're, say, exercising, in which case more blood is being pushed through the arteries. Now, this was the artery we saw before, but this thing here is the vein. You can see it's a lot floppier, but if you actually widen that out, it would be able to hold quite a lot. It's like a deflated hose, essentially. Now, blood movement in the arteries is, you've got that push from the elastic fibers and the muscles, but each organ and a bit of tissue needs to be serviced by a couple of different veins, so we need to be able to get the blood back to the heart. Now, gravity and skeletal muscle allow that to happen, because they don't have that kind of pressure to get it back to the heart. Skeletal muscle actually squeezes the blood incidentally as they move. So you moving around and walking around and fidgeting and whatever actually increases your circulation. Veins have valves and they prevent the backflow, just like the ones we saw in the heart. And they exist there in case, because it's at low pressure, in case that blood starts to slip back. And we don't want it to do that. We want it to keep going in the one direction. Pocket valves exist in veins. They're 3 little cup-shaped flaps of tissue, and they open up when that blood is being squeezed through, and then they close and don't let anything to slide back. Okay. Capillaries are the tiny little intermediary between veins and arteries. And arteries branch into smaller pathways called arterioles. Veins branch into smaller ones called venules. And that middle ground there is the capillary. Now, capillaries form networks. They branch. They rejoin each other repeatedly so that they can reach every single cell in the body. Every cell needs to be serviced by a capillary. The only exception are the lens and the cornea of the eye because they need to be transparent. So, the capillaries are actually where that dropping off of the oxygen and the nutrients happens, and the picking up of the waste products to take it back to be recycled. Sometimes capillaries are so small, they are actually only allowing blood cells through on single file. And the walls of the capillary are only 1 cell deep. That's all they have. Sometimes they have pores between them to allow things to pass between the cells, so it makes them quite permeable. Epithelial cells of the capillaries are coated in a little membrane, and it depends on what kind of tissue they're serving as to how porous these are. If they're delivering really large things like proteins, then they need to have quite large pores. Okay. Fun fact, bruising is what occurs when those blood vessels, generally the capillaries are burst and the blood cells can actually leave the vessels. Now, if we have to have a look, the function of our 3 different types of blood vessels is to service the heart and the tissues, but the veins are running away from the heart. Sorry, the veins are running to the heart and the arteries are running away from the heart. Their structure is very similar in terms of the layers, but the veins have very thin walls and the arteries have very thick walls because they have more of that elastin fiber and muscles. Veins are different to arteries in that they have valves because they don't have that high pressure blood pumping through, and they don't have the muscular fibers to keep pushing it through. Remember, the pressure in the veins and the capillaries is very, very low, but the pressure in the arteries is quite high. There's a nice summary table from BioNinja, and here are our syllabus points. Quite a lot of information in there.